All right, with the start of my first word, my time will begin. Hey everyone, thanks for joining the First Constructive Speech and Debate podcast. This is a podcast for everything speech and debate in Texas. Our names are Ryan Stokes and Kenny Adcock, and we are excited to continue this journey with you. As we begin to work through the season, it is our goal to share some stories, introduce you to experts, and facilitate conversations that we hope will help you throughout your season. So, whether you are a coach, student, competitor, or parent, trying to figure out what crazy event your student participates in, welcome to the show. Unfortunately, we had to postpone our expert interview that we had planned for today, so instead we are going to go over some popular debate jargon that you will hear in the tap rooms, CX rounds, and LD rounds this year. Learning debate jargon is a lot like learning a new language, and we would really like to help new coaches and debaters with easy to remember and understand definitions for some of those words. So, luckily for us, we have Kenny here with us today, and he spends a lot of time in tab rooms, and that's where we're going to start. You're sitting in the tab room, you're a first year judge, and you hear some jargon being thrown around that you're not really sure what it means. So, Kenny, why don't you go over some of the things that you hear in a tap room and kind of give brief explanations for what those are?
So this episode is one of the ones that's going to be the most comedic because it would have been the most beneficial when I started this journey 8 years ago. Because I cannot stress and preach loud enough that debate should count as a foreign language. It should count as a continuing language credit. And I will argue that till I'm blue in the face because there's so much jargon and it's so deep in the way that it's rooted. And sometimes you legitimately need to take it back to English 1 and just have a very concise vocab lesson. It's one of the best things that I ever did. So one of the first words that you're going to be looking for, because your kids are going to know, well, why did I win? Why did I lose? You're going to look for the letters RFD. And RFD simply stands for reason for decision. That's an operational term for why did you win or lose the round, right? What did the judge ultimately vote on? Did you win the topicality argument? Did you uphold your solvency, right? What ultimately caused you or your team or your participation in that round to win or lose the round? The next one is dashboard. I will never forget my first wrangle with tabroom, and I felt like I was in a wrestling ring with Muhammad Ali, and I was getting sucker punched left and right because I did not know how to navigate tabroom. Right, so learning how to navigate the dashboard, where to click, when to click, how to click, is definitely a tool that is going to be beneficial, and I believe we'll put together an episode on that at a later date, walking you through some of those tips and tricks that I've learned over the years. Postings and pairings, this is really kind of cool because when me and Ryan were competing in college, and I'm sure when Ryan was competing in high school, they used to do the traditional paper. You'd go to the wall, you'd fight through your competitors and your friends, and you'd figure out what room you were in, who your judge was, what side you were. And so that, the postings would go out. Now we've gone to a text blast format where a lot of tournaments are going digital. You'll get these things texted to you. They'll tell you your side, your room, your judge, all of that pertinent information. So whether a tournament's doing it in the old school method and putting it on the wall and doing it through the paper postings, or pairings as they kind of double up, that's kind of the what that tool is used for. The blast is just that text, right, that everybody gets sent when pairings are put together through tabroom. If you paired your phone with your account, they'll text you your room number, your side, your position, your opponent, your judge, all of those things. Next we have the words power match versus preset. Preset is really what round 1 and round 2 are. You're going to get an affirmative round, you're going to get a negative round, and then you're going to get round 3 that is typically what we call a flip round, where in the olden days we'd pull out a coin and we'd flip and we would decide who won the coin toss, and then they got to pick which side they preferred. That power match means that you're going to hit people in that same caliber of competitor, right? So your 2-0 competitors at that tournament, if you're having a really good day, you're going to hit somebody else who's having a really good day. Or on the contrary, if you're having a really bad day, you're going to hit somebody who also could be having a really bad day. And so those records tend to line up. They line up by speaker point. There's some differentials there. I will tell you, I think verification is one of the most important things that you need to learn as coach, because you need to learn what to look for, right? You're looking for speaker points. Were they entered in correctly? Because as somebody who exists in tab rooms, I'm human and I make mistakes. please call me on my mistakes because I want to make sure that your students place right, that the ballots are entered in correctly. And that's what that verification period is for. UIL has a mandated 15-minute window for verification. And so that's, very crucial that you go in, you check speaker points, the decision was entered correctly, because in that flip round, sometimes things can get hairy and the machine can get, misinterpreted. I can misinterpret. It happens all the time. And then you have ranks, right? So ultimately in the speech events, instead of wins and losses, we get ranks, right? So this is the #1 podcast on speech and debate right now, or at least it should be if you're out there listening. And so ranks first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, based upon your performance in the section. This will ultimately dictate whether or not you break to the next round, right? So what we're using for the term breaks is you were good enough, or you scored high enough, or you won enough rounds, or you had enough speaker points paired with enough wins that it pushed you to the elimination side of the tournament. Think about March Madness. That's kind of what it looks like. And so that's how, we establish who breaks to the next portion of the tournament. Tie breaks are really finicky by classification in different circuits, right? Some people use different parameters. Some people use speaker points. There's a mess of tie breaks. I would encourage you to look at the UIL handbook if you're largely a UIL school and know what the tiebreaker is for your particular event, whether it be CX, LD, prose, poetry, informative, or extemp. They all kind of have their own jargon and their own indebtedness to legalese conversations. And the majority of this is really complicated because UIL and TFA and NSDA, they do this differently. And Ryan has caught me before making this mistake. And that's why he kind of gets a good smirk out of it, because NSDA's tabroom account does the calculations for you if you want to be lazy, but it is not accurate to UIL majority of rules. It actually goes by the NSDA TFA rules of majority points and cumulative score, and then goes to majority. Whereas UIL wants a majority. So if you end up in a tournament and your student goes, 447, instead of them getting the cumulative score, which probably pushes them to the bottom of that section, they're going to end up 4th overall because more of the judges thought they were 4th place, and vice versa. If you have a student who finishes 117, right? So for whatever reason, and we can testify it has happened, 2 of the judges thought your kid was the best kid in the room. And so the UIL protects that kid, even though there was one squirrely judge that thought he was the worst person in the room, and ultimately, would have cost him a potential placing, or that potential breaking, or that potential, gold medal, silver medal, or however they would have placed, because that total of 9 is not a great score, and it's hard to come back from. So those are some of the things that we hear in tab, that we kind of terminology that I think coaches should have been, that I wish I had been familiar with. What about you, Ryan? You spent some time in a tab room. You hear anything that, maybe I'm missing, or things that you would like to share?
Yeah, sure. Cumulative score. As Kenny kind of covered, it adds up all the ranks from your room. So 117 is a 9, 333 is a 9, and it's going to have to go to different breaks. And that kind of explains how cum score works differently than the majority of, right? Because the 117 is going to get the nod over the 333 in UIL, but not necessarily in TFA or NSDA. It's going to come down to other breaks that happen. Review the rule books. Other words you're going to hear are consultants. These are hired people that come in and help coach your kids for usually a reasonable fee. They help with casework, case prep, and kids often relate to them more because they're usually in college. So if they won't listen to you, maybe they'll listen to somebody that you hire. I don't make teenage psychology, but it's a thing. Okay. Other things you might hear are clean versus dirty judges. Clean judges have never judged your debater. A dirty judge means that they have judged your debater, not that they're filthy.
Or they have some kind of conflict.
Yeah. Or they have some kind of conflict. Where when Kenny coached at Marshall and I was the judge at Pine Tree, he probably didn't want me judging his kids at some tournaments close to district because I could see his cases, right? So I would be considered a dirty judge in that instance. Sometimes dirty judges can end up judging your kids, though, but if that happens, it usually means they also voted your kid up and gave him a win earlier in the day. A lot of tab rooms try not to place somebody who gave your kid a loss in front of them twice. Other things that you're going to hear, and these are kind of how we break up tournaments as far as the out rounds go. Double octos, 32 kids made it through. Octos, 16 kids made it through. Quarters, 8 kids made it through. Semis, 4, and then finals, 2. All of these, and this is a word that you're going to need to know, is or should be paneled, which means that once we get into the back end of the tournament, we have 3 judges judging the round, not one.
Which you
Other
want to prepare your kids for, right? Like sometimes they can get to that paneled round and panic.
because there's more people in the room and they're not used to that. Yeah, so make sure your kids are used to speaking to more than just one person. And then the last thing I want to cover about inside a tab room are closed tab rooms versus open tab rooms. Sometimes you'll get to your region, like I did this past year, and the tab room was a closed tab room, right? Where most of the time tab rooms are open. They don't care if coaches come in and are checking them throughout the time, checking ballots or reading that. Closed tab room means you have no access.
You check your
And
blood pressure?
yeah, and get used to that once you make state, because that's a closed tab room, right? And for good reason. They don't need you going and yelling at a judge for voting your kid down in round 1 at state, right? So some tab rooms are going to be closed. That just means closed to you as a coach. Some will be open. That means feel free to come in, hang out. All right, so the next area we want to cover are going to be terms that you are traditionally going to hear in cross-examination or policy rounds. Okay, so Kenny, why don't you start with the stocks and tell us about fiat?
So I live and breathe in the stocks because as a small school coach, like that's a lot of the judges we see, and we're going to cover judge paradigms later on in the season. But that's really something that we have to structure our cases for. And so fiat is a debate theory term, right? It's the simple premise that we're going to live in a world where the AF has access to the things they say they do when the judge votes AF, right? It's kind of an immediate enforcement. It's a time frame argument. It really helps the affirmative grab onto some of the claims that they're trying to make, and really helps bolster their access to what most AFs, well, all AFs need to have a level of solvency, right? We're going to submit some level of policy change. That's a required plan text in the case, and we're going to advocate that it solves for something in the status quo. And I think here in a minute, Ryan's going to kind of break down what status quo means, so don't panic too much. But you have to solve for something. Well, what do you solve for? The obvious answer is the harms, right? The AF advocacy ends up telling the story that there is something bad happening in the status quo rooted in these harms pieces of evidence. It can be racism, it can be structural violence issues, it could be economic instability, which I think is a lot of what we're going to hear this year. But ultimately, there's a harm if you do not vote AF today and you don't put this policy that the affirmative is suggesting, and we're going to try and solve for that. You want to try and link these two together, right? Inherently, if you have a harm, your solvency should solve that very harm that you read in your AF. I can't tell you how many AFs I've seen where they read a harm of like racism and then they solve biodiversity. They never really create a story for me as the AF goes on. Then we have to have something called inherency, right? There needs to be a justified reason for the plan, right? Why is this not happening in the status quo? There's that word again. Again, I think Ryan's going to do a better job explaining that here in a minute. But ultimately, why is this the suggested plan that the affirmative wants the judge to vote on or wants to change? Why has it not already happened? Right, that's the conversation that happens here in this piece of evidence. I know last year on the NATO topic, Ryan had a great argument that you had to have a piece of inherency argument that was 3 years or older. I think inherency does need to be recent. I think it needs to be present and it needs to be current, especially with this economic topic.
I
Which
think you
takes
mean
us.
3 years or newer, Kitty.
Oh yeah. My apologies.
Also, not to steal your thunder, but could you expand on structural versus attitudinal inherency, because they might hear a little bit of a difference in those two?
So I know we have a friend of ours that really loves to run inherency arguments down in Carthage. Russell Rowe is an incredible coach, and he builds his kids to really hammer the stock issues. And I think you're absolutely right, especially if you're in the East Texas circuit, right? So structural inherency is truly just something that actually is in the way, right? It's a physical policy barrier. It's something that truly is actively physically in the way. Attitude is quite literally that, right? You have a toddler. She has a pretty big attitude. Um, And so that's what it is, right? Like, why won't your child eat peas? Well, because they simply don't like them, right? That is the attitude, right? Like, so right now, the status quo of America is that we don't really want to address economic policy. That's an attitude, not a structure. And so that's a great example there of the difference between attitude and structural. A great structural barrier that we might see in this year is, like tax reform. Trump's tax reform would be a great structural inherency for a potential AF. But so it's true policy, true to true, something that's in the existent that would be, whereas attitude is just, I really don't like that, so I'm not gonna do that. Right. Think about your teenagers who have a little bit of attitude about not wanting to clean their room or do their homework. That's attitudinal inherency.
Awesome.
Now, topicality is an interesting phrase. The way that I teach my kids is that I talk about the resolution like our framers created a playground. And in our playground, they put Social Security, they put basic income, they put what's the third area?
Did you say Social Security?
I said Social Security, I said basic income.
Then you must be talking about,
Federal jobs guarantee.
yes,
Federal jobs
FDR.
guarantee. I honestly, I don't think this is going to be a huge area, but I think it is an important one to address. So you've got to have one of those, or fiscal redistribution or something, right? These are all things that the framers established as the playground. You have to adhere to this playground. They built us a slide, they built us a playground, they built us a merry-go-round, they put a pool in for us. What we're not going to be doing is playing, over on the water park. And so this is how I explain topicality, right? We need to exist in this playground that the framers established and not, go off into outer space. And this is how we're going to address this and ultimately work on space satellites or anything of that nature, because that's not topical, right? That's not what the framers designed. That's not what the way the words were intended to be interpreted. And so topicality becomes an issue that we must adhere to. And so that's kind of some of the core stock issues. Briefly on significance, right? But why is it a big deal? Right? We have to advocate that it impacts a lot of people, or ultimately it hurts or helps a lot of people, and that's the last stock of significance. So why don't there's some off case positions that I think you're going to get into, Ryan. Why don't you give us some of those?
Okay, yeah. So if the stocks are on case, they are arguments that directly address the affirmative plan. Then off case are arguments that address the impacts of that plan, or they offer up different ways of looking at it to create the negative world, which we'll talk about later. So the first one are disadvantages, also known as disads or DAs. They come with a story that starts with uniqueness, establishing the status quo, something's going on right now. They then have what's called a link. This is what attaches the disadvantage to the affirmative plan, and it shows how it affects that status quo that you established in your uniqueness. When that happens, the next part is an internal link. Internal link, which shows that the change in the status quo is going to create something bad. Now, your link and your internal link create a link story and should have a what we call a bright line inside of it, which really shows how they're connected to each other. Once this happens, then you get to throw your big bad impact down at the end, which
Hashtag
allows you
nuclear
to,
war, Oppenheimer for the win.
yes. Funny that Barbenheimer came out recently for
If
this
you haven't seen
for this
Oppenheimer, I
topic.
highly recommend it.
Yeah. All right, so that's a disadvantage. So essentially, it's a story about how the status quo is a certain way. The AF changes that, and it creates a bad thing. Next, we have a counter plan. Nothing goes better with a disadvantage than a counter plan. The AF is bad. Here's a new way to do it. I'm not going to go super in depth into counter plan theory tonight. I'm just going to tell you that they exist. We will be covering them in a later podcast, but for now, counter plan, just an alternate plan to the affirmatives. And then you have a critique, which is, once again, not going to go super in depth here, is just how it sounds, a critique of something that the AF is doing or perpetuates through not addressing it. right? So a lot of your isms fall into here that debaters find important that they will advocate for. All right, with that said, we're trying to keep on time since there's so much jargon. We're going to keep moving. Kenny, what is new in the two?
Hey, I do think it is important to highlight on the counter plan that they don't have to be topical.
Fair.
That's why we get the space CP or the Oppenheimer CP that might float around. I don't know. But new in the two, there are two camps with this. There are people that believe the 2AC and 2NC have the ability to make new arguments. There's a camp of individuals, and there's nothing wrong with this. This is their philosophy that believe you can make new arguments, new T's, new disadvantages, new on case arguments, and it's totally valid. There's also a camp of people that believe this is incredibly not valid, and this is incredibly abusive to the round. And I think at some point we might want to structure an episode on how to theoretically handle this, because that just kind of gives away the answer. But that's one of the big things that happens is the new and the two argument or not argument. And so with the 13-minute block, which is really the next term you need to hear when talking about as the round goes on. The neg has 13 minutes of unfiltered, just the F is really, really bad. And you're going to hear for 13 minutes straight about how bad this F is. And then all of a sudden, the F is going to have to respond to everything that happened in this 13-minute block with their 5-minute 1AR. And it gets hard because a good negative team will spread the affirmative team very thin in this block. Because what happens is the neg will split. They'll do what's called splitting the block. And the 8-minute constructive, they'll go hard on 2 or 3 of the arguments and just lay on card work, lay on extensions, lay on reasons why the AF is bad. And then the 5-minute 1NR will just get up there and they'll pick up 2 or 3 more arguments that they had just laid on, right? If they ran a new DA in that 2NC, guess what? They now have the ability to pick up the 2 or 3 DAs they already read and extend them across the flow, and the affirmative has to deal with them. They have to deal with them, which is going to take us into one of our phrases here in a minute, where a lot of the 1ARs will be really fast. They will likely spread on you because if a good negative team has done their job, there's a lot of work to get through in that 5-minute speech. And so those are some things that happen in that 2 to 1NR or 1AR section. Are there any other things in maybe elements of those arguments that you want to kind of expand on, Ryan?
No, not really. I am going to introduce a few new words. Standards. These are reasons to prefer an argument, usually tied to theory or topicality, which is kind of pseudo theory. Then you also have limits. This is saying that we have to confine the debate space to make it fair, which plays into the role of your next word, ground, which is saying that the affirmative and the negative team should have equal playing field in the debate space. It should be a 50-50. So if it becomes one way or the other due to arguments that are run, then that is bad for debate. Next, you have conditional arguments, which are arguments that you can drop without being penalized. And then you have unconditional, which means I will not drop this at any point in the debate. And if I do, I should probably lose it. With that being said, we're going to move on from CX and hop into Lincoln Douglas debate. We're going to try to keep this fairly quick. So these are going to be loose, quick definitions. We are going to have a Lincoln Douglas special coming up later, about a month from now, where we're really going to dive into these terms, but we want to go ahead and introduce them to you tonight. So, Kenny, tell me about framework, value, and criterion.
So at some point we're going to cover judge paradigms, and I think when it comes to LD, this is one of the most important pieces in the piece of casework. Your framework essentially is another term for your value criterion. It kind of becomes this all-encompassing word that the debaters will use to group the argumentation, so they can address it more concisely and can save time, create that time allocation budget throughout the speech. Your value is simply put the value for the round, right? Like in LD, it's a value to value debate. And ultimately, we're going to cover some values that you could use here in a minute. But it really is as simple as this is what I'm going to value for the round. So me and Ryan are friends, so we value friendliness. The criterion is Ryan called me at 2 a.m. So we wanted to maximize our friendship by creating a podcast, right? That criterion is a measurable phrase for how well or how effective do you achieve, do you avoid, or do you encompass the value statement? So there's some other things that go into a case. I'm going to leave you observation. I think we can debate about where that falls in the flow, because personally, I think it's framework, but I'm going to let you have it this time. So anything, what are the other elements of a case?
Yep. So after you establish your traditional framework of the value criterion, you can hit an observation, which is essentially just something that either the affirmative or the negative states to be true. Strategically, these are used to limit the round most of the time in a way that, if not addressed, can make it easier for one side to win the round by shifting one of those keywords we talked about in CX, the ground of the round, a little bit. Quick example of an observation would be like, well, because we are Americans and it would be wrong of us to try to talk as non-American people. When addressing the topic today, we should only look through an American perspective because it's the only one we can educationally talk to, right? But if it's something like gentrification, which we had a little while back, there's a lot of different gentrification that happens around the world that is equally as bad as happens in America underneath that specific
Or
resolution.
gentrification doesn't actually exist. That was my favorite.
Yeah, but anyway, by limiting it just to America, you take away a lot of the arguments, right? So that's kind of what an observation does. It doesn't win either round, but it could give you a strategic leg up. Next, you get into your contentions. These are your claim warrant impacts that prove your value criterions usefulness in the real world, right? So if I value quality of life and I'm going to achieve it through pragmatic approaches, right? Like doing things that make sense to achieve quality of life, then my contentions are going to be things that I claim that make sense, that give people a good life, okay, to put it simply. Next, you also have this weird one, which is an independent voter. It's not very heard of very often, but it sits outside of the case that you're making as just an independent reason to vote for one side or the other. I've seen it win, I've seen it lose. It's weird.
I've seen
Kenny,
it explode. So
lightning round of LD. Throw out some of the common values that our listeners need to know. You don't have to
so
describe them to them. Just give them to them so that they can go look them up for themselves.
here's what I would encourage you to. You need to have these prep to use and prep to answer. The first is morality. If you are a UIL team specifically, morality is going to be used, beaten to death, and ultimately put into perspective. Utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, Locke, these guys, look up their version of util. They wrote on it. They're experts. Deontology, look for your philosophers, right? Rooted there. Pragmatism, social contract theory, again, John Stuart Mill, John Locke, these guys really put together some good literature on this. Kant's categorical imperative, I would challenge you to know this backwards and forwards because we hear it a lot. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is another one that's really popular. Legitimate government, government legitimacy, those are kind of phrased the same. Truth, quality of life, those are a couple others. Justice, please don't forget justice. If justice will get used and abused and beat to death and then done some more. It's like Shrek number 10 in the Lincoln Douglas debate world. So those are a couple that I would highly encourage our listeners to not only know how to use, but be prepared to debate against and have some answers to as to why they're bad, because it'll help you in future rounds.
Just quick tip: have your kids keep their flows. Every time you hear a new value, you're writing a block on it the next day.
To extend block, right, is ultimately a term to defend that argument, right? So
Yes.
make sure that you're blocking out those arguments as they happen live throughout Saturdays, because tournaments are won on Wednesdays. They're not won on Saturdays in round.
All right. Now we're going to hop into some crossover debate terms, that ones that aren't specific to any one type of debate, but are terms that you're going to need to know and be familiar with as the season goes on. The first one being obviously affirmative. This is going to be the team that is fighting for the resolution. Negative, the other term you need to know, are going to be the team that or individual that is going against the resolution. And then you are going to need know the word constructive and the word rebuttal. Constructive speeches are speeches that are allowed to have new arguments run in them, which is why when the second negative constructive in CX brings in new arguments, you get that new in the two phrase. Okay. Rebuttals means that no new argument should be run, only clarification of current argument threads. Okay. Kenny, hit us with claim, warrant, impact, and drops.
The Tolman method of argumentation, right? Claim the ice cream is better than cake. Warrant, ultimately, because ice cream won't melt, and cake is just soggy. Impact is we eat more ice cream than we do cake in the United States, right? Like, it follows this formulaic experience. Impact drops, ultimately Ryan dropped that cake is better than ice cream, so therefore cake wins, and ultimately we decide that chocolate cake is better, and we should eat that at the end of this round.
Counterplan, ice cream cake. Joking. Next, I want to talk about burden of proof. Or prima facie. This is the goal of the affirmative team whenever they submit their case forward. They have to prove that resolution to be true, whether that be through their policy or their framework in LD. Okay, policy and CX, framework in LD. They have to prove it true. To do prima facie in CX, you have to have all your stocks or tell one of the three different case structures that you put forward to present an actual prima facie case. On the negative side, you have the burden of clash, or some people prefer the burden of rejoinder, which means that it's not just that I am looking to clash with you, I am looking to prove the resolution untrue myself, right? And this really opens up for the critique style arguments in cross examination and that are leaking into LD, right? Because I don't just have to clash with you. If I can prove the resolution itself is bad or wrong, then I should also probably be able to win the round. And then the term take and prep. Instead of debaters looking at the judge and saying, yes, I would like to use my prep time, they're just going to say take and prep because they think they sound cool. They have 8 minutes in CX. They have 4 minutes in LD. Keep it as if you're judging the round, you should also keep it to keep them honest, but most kids do a good job. All right, Kenny, what else you got?
I would encourage us to do a taking prep theory episode at some point. So we got impact calc, right? This is something you're going to hear largely in CX. It's bled over in LD, but largely in CX. How long does it take the impact to happen? How many people died? And then how likely is it to kill? Right? That's the impact calculus formula. They need to do all of those things to ensure a proper impact calc for the round. If not, don't let them get away with it. Please hold them accountable to that structure. Voters, right? Why are they winning? Tell them to control your pin, right? Why are you circling F? Why are you circling neg? Tell them to tell you. They will. They're good at those things. Roll of the ballot. Ultimately, there's an argument out there that says the ballot is designed to do this structural thing, that it's going to change the world, and they're going to advocate and tell you how it's going to do that and what you're going to do. Paradigm, how do you view the round? We're going to cover this later in an episode, so I'm not going to go into super depth, but ultimately how you view the round. Most of our listeners are probably lay judges in multiple other factions, but we'll get into details in that. Spreading. At the end of the day, we see the impact calculus, time frame, magnitude, probability. Spreading overwhelms a lot of people, but it's just speed reading. There are different levels of it. I'm not very good at it. I can be if I practice, but and then speaks, right? How high did you rank the speaker? I would encourage people never to go below a 25. You only go below a 25 if something truly egregious, violating, racist, aggressive, something truly egregious happens. Otherwise, you're looking for that 27 to 30 sweet spot. Decimal points to your friends. Different tournaments use them. Different tournaments don't. We can get into that theory later. What about you, Ryan? Anything else you want to add?
All right, two terms you're going to hear that you need to know: aft world versus squo. Okay, technically, I guess that's 4 words. But the affirmative world is what the affirmative team is advocating the world would be like after you institute their policy or their framework. The negative team advocates for the status quo, or if they have a counter plan, how they make the world better. Okay, so ultimately, it's an easy way for you to evaluate the round and teach your kids to paint an easy story for judges on how to evaluate the round is to compare the AF world versus whatever world the negative is advocating for. Next, fast words you need to know. Turn means that I moved the argument from going forward to going the other direction, right? It's like doing a U turn. So, impact climate change will kill us all. Turn climate change is actually good, it increases the growing season. And we're going to get to swim, and it'll clean up some of the coastal cities because they'll be put underwater, right? Not a good argument, but is an example of a term. Permutation or perm means that we can do the negative counterplan and the AF at the same time. Taglines are going to be the claims and the arguments on the contention level debate, which means that they are going to be essentially things that you can write down to keep track of what an argument is. Extension means that I am carrying my arguments forward in the round. Flow means notes that I'm taking. Cross apply means I'm taking one argument and applying it to multiple different ones on the other side. And then card is just the evidence that I have cut for the round. Okay. Kenny, hit us with the last thing as we're running down on time.
So as we get ready to close, CX is not just cross-examination debate. It stands for the questioning period, so it is cross-examine. It's universal. Open CX, well, it's TFA and NSDA only. It is not UIL. Please tell your kids don't use it. Both partners can engage in CX at that point. Close is what UIL requires. You are at the podium by yourself, sink or swim, figure it out. You better know the case. Flashing is where we take the flash drive, we put the case on it, and we give it to the opponent. This should happen during CX time or pre or post round. Speech drop has become really popular, and it's become the more common, where they set up a digital room, they drop the evidence, and they work through it that way. It helps with flow, it helps clean up the round, and keeps things organized. Ryan, I think I may hear the timer.
Oh, yep, there it is. Thank you all for joining. We hope that you were able to learn something from the terms that we put forward. As always, this was the First Constructive. Join us next week for part 2 for a 2-part episode going over the affirmative and negative arguments found in the NCDA novice packet. Your kids will use it. This is going to be an excellent 2-part series that people need to tune in for as we give strategies and things that we think you can actually applicably use in round. Thank you.
Bye.